October 15th, 1971, 3:47 a.m., somewhere beneath the freezing waters of the Sea of Okhotsk. A sound that shouldn't exist echoed through the steel hull of the USS Halibut. Every man aboard froze. The submarine was sitting motionless, 400 feet below the surface, in waters that belonged to the Soviet Union. If detected, there would be no rescue, no negotiation, no survival. Captain James Bradley gripped the periscope mount, his knuckles white. Above them, somewhere in the darkness, a Soviet destroyer was circling. Its sonar pings cut through the water like invisible searchlights, hunting for something its crew didn't even know existed. Outside the submarine, 12 American divers were working in complete darkness, their breathing equipment specially modified to release no bubbles. They were doing something that had never been attempted before in human history. They were attaching a recording device to a Soviet military communications cable that ran along the ocean floor. If those divers were caught, the United States would deny they existed. If the submarine was found, it would be destroyed. And if the mission failed, the Soviet Union would never know that for the next decade, America would listen to every single word they said. This is the true story of Operation Ivy Bells, the most audacious underwater espionage mission ever conducted. It's a story of genius engineering, impossible courage, and a betrayal that would eventually bring it all crashing down. But to understand how 12 divers ended up in freezing Soviet waters with the fate of the Cold War in their hands, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to a submarine that was never supposed to become a spy ship, and a Navy captain who saw possibilities where everyone else saw junk. If you find this story as incredible as I do, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this one take weeks to research, and your support helps us bring more of these hidden chapters of history to light. Now, let's continue. The USS Halibut was born in 1960, and from the very beginning she was different. Most submarines of her era were designed to do one thing: hunt and kill enemy ships. The Halibut was designed to carry nuclear missiles. She was one of the first submarines capable of launching a Regulus cruise missile, a weapon that could deliver a nuclear warhead to a target over 500 miles away. For 5 years, the Halibut prowled the Pacific Ocean, carrying enough destructive power to level a major city. Her crew trained endlessly for a war that everyone prayed would never come. They practiced launching procedures, ran silent through enemy waters, and waited for orders that, thankfully, never arrived. But by 1965, the Halibut was becoming obsolete. Newer submarines carrying Polaris missiles were faster, quieter, and could strike targets over 1,000 miles away. The Regulus system was being retired, and the Navy faced a decision: scrap the Halibut or find her a new purpose. What they chose would change the course of the Cold War. Deep within the Pentagon, a small group of intelligence officers had been wrestling with a problem that seemed impossible to solve. The Soviet Union's nuclear submarine fleet was growing at an alarming rate. These submarines could launch nuclear missiles at American cities with virtually no warning. And the terrifying truth was that the United States had no reliable way to track them. Soviet submarines were getting quieter. Their captains were learning to exploit ocean temperature layers and underwater terrain to disappear. American listening stations could sometimes detect them leaving port, but once they reached deep water, they vanished like ghosts. The intelligence officers knew that somewhere in the Soviet Union, there had to be a command structure. Orders had to flow from Moscow to submarine commanders. Logistics had to be coordinated. Reports had to be filed. The Soviets weren't using radio for this communication because radio signals could be intercepted. They had to be using something else. The answer came from an unlikely source, a young naval officer who had grown up near the Chesapeake Bay. He remembered something from his childhood, something that most people would have dismissed as irrelevant. He remembered seeing signs along the shore warning boaters about underwater telephone cables. The Soviets, he realized, must be using underwater cables too. Cables running from their naval bases to their submarine fleets. Cables carrying the most sensitive military communications in the world. And unlike radio signals, which scattered across the atmosphere, cable communications stayed contained in a single line running along the ocean floor. If America could find those cables, they could tap them. They could listen to every order, every report, every piece of intelligence the Soviet Navy transmitted. There was just one problem. No one knew if such cables existed or where they might be located, and even if they found them, tapping an underwater cable in enemy waters was something that had never been done before. But what no one realized yet was that the solution to their problem was sitting in a shipyard in San Francisco, waiting to be scrapped. The USS Halibut was about to begin her second life. The man who would transform the Halibut from an obsolete missile carrier into the most sophisticated spy submarine in the world was Captain James Bradley. He was 42 years old, with a reputation for creative thinking that sometimes bordered on insubordination. His superiors respected his intelligence, but worried about his tendency to ignore rules he considered unnecessary. Bradley had been following the intelligence community's cable problem with growing interest. He believed he knew how to find the Soviet cables, But his solution required something unusual, a submarine that could sit motionless on the ocean floor for hours or even days at a time in waters that were supposed to be impossible to enter. The Halibut, with her large missile compartment now empty, was perfect. Bradley proposed converting that space into an underwater research station. He wanted to install cameras, lights, and robotic equipment that could search the ocean floor. He wanted to add a decompression chamber so divers could work outside the submarine at extreme depths. And he wanted to equip the Halibut with something called a fish, a remote-controlled underwater vehicle that could explore areas too dangerous for human divers. The Navy was skeptical. Such a conversion would cost millions of dollars. The technology Bradley wanted to install didn't exist yet, and the missions he was proposing would put the submarine and her crew in extraordinary danger. But the potential intelligence value was too great to ignore. In 1968, the Navy gave Bradley permission to begin the conversion. The Halibut was towed to the Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California, and the work began. What happened over the next 2 years was one of the most remarkable engineering projects of the Cold War. Workers installed a massive door in the bottom of the Halibut's hull, large enough for divers and equipment to pass through. They built a decompression chamber called the Bat Cave, where divers could safely adjust to surface pressure after working at extreme depths. They created an elaborate camera system that could photograph the ocean floor in complete darkness. And they installed something that had never existed before, a remote-controlled underwater vehicle called the Fish. This was not a simple machine. The Fish was equipped with cameras, lights, and mechanical arms. It could be controlled from inside the submarine using a cable connection, allowing the crew to explore the ocean floor without risking human lives. When the conversion was complete in 1970, the Halibut looked like no other submarine in the world. From the outside, she appeared relatively normal, but inside, she was a floating spy station capable of operations that most people would have considered science fiction. Now came the hard part, finding the Soviet cables. Bradley's plan was based on a simple observation. In the United States, areas with underwater cables were marked with warning signs to prevent ships from accidentally damaging them with their anchors. The Soviets, Bradley reasoned, probably did the same thing. This might sound like an obvious idea, but what Bradley was proposing was extraordinarily dangerous. To look for warning signs, the Halibut would have to enter Soviet territorial waters. She would have to approach the coast close enough to observe the shoreline. And she would have to do all of this while avoiding detection by one of the most heavily defended naval regions on Earth. The Sea of Okhotsk was the Soviet Union's most protected body of water. Surrounded by Russian territory on 3 sides and the heavily fortified Kuril Islands on the 4th, it was considered virtually impenetrable. The Soviets used it as a sanctuary for their ballistic missile submarines. They believed that no enemy vessel could enter without being detected. They were wrong. In August 1971, the USS Halibut slipped through a gap in the Kuril Islands and entered the Sea of Okhotsk. For the crew, this was the most terrifying moment of the mission. The channel they used was less than a mile wide, with Soviet listening posts on both sides. If they were detected, there would be nowhere to run. But the Halibut was running silent. Her engines were barely turning. Her crew had been trained to make no unnecessary noise. Even conversations were conducted in whispers. They made it through. For the next several weeks, the Halibut prowled the edges of the Sea of Okhotsk, her periscope barely breaking the surface as she studied the Soviet coastline. The crew photographed everything: military installations, ship movements, radar stations. But what they were really looking for was much smaller. One morning, as the Halibut cruised along the coast of the Kamchatka Peninsula, a lookout spotted something through the periscope. It was a sign on the shore, written in Russian. The sign showed an anchor with a line through it, the universal symbol for no anchoring. Bradley felt his heart rate increase. Signs like that were placed for one reason: to protect underwater cables. But finding the sign was only the beginning. The cable, if it existed, could be anywhere on the ocean floor below them. It might be buried under mud. It might be damaged or abandoned. And searching for it would mean sitting motionless in Soviet waters, completely vulnerable for days at a time. Bradley made the decision. They would search. What followed was one of the most nerve-wracking operations in submarine history. The Halibut descended to the ocean floor and came to rest in the mud, 400 feet beneath the surface. Then she began deploying her equipment. The Fish went out first, controlled by operators inside the submarine who watched its camera feed on small monitors. Hour after hour, the Fish crisscrossed the ocean floor, its lights illuminating a ghostly landscape of mud, rocks, and marine life that had never seen light before. The crew worked in shifts, sleeping in bunks that vibrated with the low hum of the submarine's equipment. They ate cold meals to avoid using the galley, which would make noise. They spoke in whispers and walked in socks to minimize sound. Above them, Soviet ships passed back and forth on regular patrols. Sometimes their sonar pings would echo through the Halibut's hull. and every man aboard would hold his breath, waiting to see if they had been detected. Days passed. The fish found nothing. The crew's nerves were fraying. Their air was getting stale. Bradley knew he couldn't stay much longer. Then, on the 5th day, the fish's cameras captured something that made the entire control room go silent. There, lying in the mud, was a thick black cable stretching across the ocean floor. It was exactly what they had been looking for. But what they found next to it was even more significant. The cable was not bare. Attached to it at regular intervals were cylindrical objects about the size of garbage cans. After hours of analysis, the submarine's intelligence officers realized what they were looking at. The Soviets had attached repeaters to the cable. These were amplifiers designed to boost the signal over long distances. The repeaters meant the cable was still active, and they meant the cable was carrying important communications. Otherwise, why would the Soviets bother maintaining it? Bradley now faced the most difficult decision of the mission. They had found the cable. They knew it was being used, but they had no way to tap it. The equipment they would need to actually record the cable's communications didn't exist yet. Building it would take months, possibly years, and returning to this exact spot in the middle of Soviet territorial waters would require them to repeat the entire terrifying journey. Bradley made his decision. They would mark the cable's position with extreme precision, return to base, and begin planning the actual tap. The intelligence they had already gathered proved the concept was viable. Now they had to develop the technology to exploit it. The Halibut surfaced 3 weeks later at the American naval base in Pearl Harbor. Bradley went immediately to Washington to brief intelligence officials on what they had found. The reaction was electric. For years, the intelligence community had been searching for a way to penetrate Soviet naval communications. The Halibut had found it. Now they needed to build the tools to exploit this discovery. Over the next several months, the most secretive engineering project of the Cold War took shape. It was given the code name Ivy Bells. The National Security Agency worked with private contractors to design something that had never existed before, an underwater wiretapping device that could be attached to a cable without cutting or damaging it. This was crucial because cutting the cable would alert the Soviets immediately. The solution they developed was ingenious. The device was about 6 feet long and 3 feet in diameter, wrapped in a cylindrical housing that could be clamped around the cable. Inside were induction coils that could pick up the electromagnetic signals passing through the cable without physically touching the wires inside. The device was completely passive. It had no power source that could be detected. It simply listened to the signals passing through the cable and recorded them on magnetic tape. Every few weeks, a submarine would return to retrieve the recorded tapes and install fresh ones. But the device's design created a new problem. Someone had to physically attach it to the cable, and that meant divers would have to work on the ocean floor in Soviet waters, in near-freezing temperatures, at depths that pushed the limits of human endurance. The Navy began training a special unit of divers for the mission. These men were among the best in the world, experienced in deep-sea saturation diving. They trained for months in conditions designed to simulate the Sea of Okhotsk. They practiced attaching the device to cables in total darkness. They learned to work in water so cold that exposure without protective equipment meant death within minutes. The divers also faced a unique psychological challenge. They would be working in enemy waters, knowing that if they were discovered, there would be no rescue. The submarine could not surface to help them. If they were captured, the United States would deny their existence. They would be listed as having died in a training accident, and their families would never know the truth. Every single diver volunteered anyway. In October 1972, the USS Halibut returned to the Sea of Okhotsk. This time, she was carrying the completed wiretapping device and a team of 12 saturation divers. The journey through the Kuril Islands was even more harrowing than before. Soviet naval activity had increased. Patrol boats crisscrossed the channel. Anti-submarine aircraft flew overhead. At one point, the Halibut had to sit motionless on the bottom for 36 hours while a Soviet destroyer conducted exercises directly above them. But they made it through. When the Halibut reached the marked position of the cable, the divers prepared for their mission. The saturation diving process was itself a test of endurance. The divers entered the decompression chamber and breathed a special mixture of helium and oxygen, while the pressure inside was slowly increased to match the pressure at the working depth. This process took nearly 24 hours. Once pressurized, the divers entered a smaller chamber called the diving trunk. Water was allowed to flood the chamber, and when it was full, a hatch opened to the ocean floor. The first diver who exited described the experience as stepping into another world. The water was absolutely black. The cold bit through his diving suit immediately. His only illumination was a small headlamp that created a sphere of visibility about 10 feet wide. Beyond that, nothing but darkness. The divers worked in shifts, 2 at a time, feeling their way along the ocean floor until they found the cable. The wiretapping device was lowered from the submarine on a cable, and the divers wrestled it into position. In the freezing darkness, working with thick gloves that reduced their dexterity, they clamped the device around the cable and activated its recording system. The entire operation took 6 hours. When it was complete, the divers returned to the decompression chamber, and the slow process of returning to normal pressure began. The Halibut slipped away from the Soviet coast, carrying intelligence that would reshape American understanding of the Soviet military. But what they didn't know yet was just how valuable that intelligence would become. The first tapes retrieved from the Ivy Bells device exceeded all expectations. The cable the Halibut had tapped carried communications between Soviet naval headquarters in Vladivostok and the ballistic missile submarine base at Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. Every order, every report, every piece of operational data passed through this cable. Intelligence analysts in Washington discovered something remarkable. The Soviets believed so strongly that the cable was secure that they weren't encrypting most of their communications. They were sending classified information in plain text, assuming that no one could possibly intercept it. The United States was suddenly reading the Soviet Navy's mail. Over the following months, the Ivy Bells program expanded. The Halibut made repeated trips to the Sea of Okhotsk, retrieving recorded tapes and installing fresh ones. The intelligence value was staggering. America learned the patrol patterns of Soviet submarines. They discovered the locations of underwater listening stations. They obtained technical specifications for new weapon systems. They even listened to conversations between admirals discussing strategy and operational readiness. One particularly valuable piece of intelligence concerned Soviet submarine noise levels. The recordings revealed that Soviet submarines were significantly louder than American intelligence had previously estimated. This information allowed the Navy to update its detection systems and better track Soviet submarines worldwide. But the success of Ivy Bells created its own problems. The operation was so valuable that intelligence officials became increasingly cautious about protecting it. Access to the information was restricted to fewer than 100 people in the entire government. Even most senior military officers didn't know it existed. The Halibut couldn't continue the mission forever. By 1976, she was showing her age. Her equipment was wearing out. Her crew was exhausted from years of the most stressful operations imaginable. The Navy needed a replacement. They found one in the USS Parche, a newer submarine that underwent the same conversion process the Halibut had experienced years before. The Parche was faster, quieter, and equipped with more advanced technology. She would continue the Ivy Bells mission for the next 2 decades. But the transfer of operations created new risks. More people now knew about the program. More equipment existed that could reveal its secrets. And somewhere in the expanding circle of knowledge, a traitor was waiting. His name was Ronald Pelton. Pelton worked for the National Security Agency as an intelligence analyst. He had access to some of America's most sensitive secrets, including details of the Ivy Bells program. He knew about the cable taps. He knew about the submarine operations. He knew how to destroy everything the Halibut and her crew had built. In 1980, Pelton walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and offered to sell everything he knew. The Soviets paid him $35,000. It was the best investment they ever made. Within months of Pelton's betrayal, the Soviets sent a naval vessel to the exact location where the Ivy Bells device was attached to their cable. Divers recovered the wiretapping device and brought it to Moscow, where it was analyzed by military intelligence. The Soviets were stunned. They had believed their underwater communications were completely secure. The discovery of the American device proved that for nearly a decade, their most sensitive naval communications had been intercepted. The immediate response was a massive security overhaul. The Soviets began encrypting all cable communications. They increased patrols around sensitive installations. They developed new procedures for detecting underwater intruders. But the damage had already been done. The intelligence gathered through Ivy Bells had fundamentally changed America's understanding of Soviet naval capabilities. It had provided early warning of new weapon systems. It had revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited in a potential conflict. And it had demonstrated that even the most protected secrets were vulnerable to American ingenuity and courage. The story of Ivy Bells didn't become public until 1986, when Pelton was arrested and tried for espionage. Even then, many details remained classified. The full scope of the operation wouldn't be understood for decades. When the extent of Pelton's treachery became clear, the intelligence community was devastated. Years of dangerous work, incredible technological achievement, and priceless intelligence had been compromised for $35,000. Men had risked their lives in freezing Soviet waters, and a single traitor had made their sacrifice meaningless. But that assessment wasn't entirely fair. The intelligence gathered through Ivy Bells had already been analyzed, processed, and acted upon. The insights it provided couldn't be taken back. American strategists understood Soviet naval capabilities in ways that would have been impossible otherwise. That knowledge influenced military planning, diplomatic negotiations, and technological development for years afterward. And the techniques pioneered by the Halibut didn't disappear with the compromise of Ivy Bells. The technology of underwater surveillance continued to advance. Other cables were tapped in other locations. The tradition of submarine espionage that the Halibut had begun continued through the end of the Cold War and beyond. The men who served aboard the Halibut never received public recognition for what they accomplished. Their missions remained classified. Their achievements were known only to a small circle of intelligence professionals who understood the risks they had taken. But among those who knew, the Halibut and her crew were legends. Captain James Bradley retired from the Navy in 1982, his contributions to national security known only to those with the highest clearances. He died in 2001, his obituary making no mention of the operations that had defined his career. The divers who worked in the freezing waters of the Sea of Okhotsk returned to ordinary lives. Some struggled with the physical effects of their deep-sea work, others dealt with the psychological burden of secrets they could never share. All of them carried the knowledge of what they had accomplished, even if they could never speak of it. The USS Halibut was decommissioned in 1976 and eventually scrapped. Her hulk contained no evidence of the remarkable missions she had performed. The equipment that had made her unique was removed and destroyed. Only the memories of her crew remained. But the legacy of Ivy Bells extended far beyond a single submarine or a single crew. The operation demonstrated that with enough creativity, courage, and technological innovation, the impossible could become possible. It showed that secrets thought to be impenetrable could be compromised by those willing to take extraordinary risks. For the Soviet Union, Ivy Bells was a humiliating revelation. Their most secure communications had been intercepted for years without their knowledge. The discovery exposed fundamental weaknesses in their security procedures and forced a complete reevaluation of how they protected sensitive information. For the United States, Ivy Bells was a triumph of intelligence collection that provided insights into Soviet capabilities that couldn't have been obtained any other way. It was also a reminder of the fragility of secrets. One traitor, motivated by money or ideology, could destroy years of work in a single conversation. The Cold War would continue for another decade after Ivy Bells was compromised. Both sides would continue developing new submarines, new weapons, and new methods of surveillance and counter-surveillance. The cat-and-mouse game beneath the waves never really ended. But nothing quite matched the audacity of Ivy Bells. A submarine sitting on the bottom of enemy waters, divers working in absolute darkness to tap cables that the enemy believed were untouchable. Intelligence flowing back to Washington that changed America's understanding of its greatest adversary. It was, in many ways, the perfect Cold War operation. Brilliant, dangerous, successful, and ultimately betrayed. The Soviets thought their submarines were untrackable. They thought their communications were secure. They thought the Sea of Okhotsk was their personal sanctuary, impenetrable to any adversary. They were wrong about all of it. And the USS Halibut had been recording them for 6 years before they ever suspected a thing. The story of the Halibut and Ivy Bells carries lessons that remain relevant today. In an era of cyber warfare and electronic surveillance, the fundamental principles haven't changed. The most secure systems can be compromised by innovative thinking. The greatest secrets can be betrayed by those trusted to keep them. And the courage of individuals operating in hostile territory can change the course of history. The men who served aboard the Halibut understood something that most people never experience. They knew that their work mattered in ways that went far beyond their own lives. Every time they descended beneath the waves, every time they sat in silence while enemy ships passed overhead, every time a diver entered the freezing darkness to work on the ocean floor, they were contributing to something larger than themselves. That contribution remained secret for decades. Many of them went to their graves without recognition, their families never knowing the truth about where they had been or what they had done. In a world that celebrates military heroism with parades and medals, the heroes of submarine espionage remained invisible. But their legacy endures. The tradition of silent service that they embodied continues in submarines around the world. The technology they pioneered evolved into capabilities that remain classified to this day. The intelligence they gathered helped prevent the Cold War from becoming a hot war, contributing to the deterrence that kept two nuclear powers from destroying each other. When historians look back at the Cold War, they often focus on the big events, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall, the arms race, but the Cold War was also fought in smaller, quieter ways. In laboratories where scientists developed surveillance technology, in training facilities where divers learned to work at impossible depths, in submarines that prowled through enemy waters, gathering information that would never make headlines. The USS Halibut was one small part of that larger struggle. Her crew was one small group among the thousands who served in the shadow wars of the Cold War era. But their story captures something essential about that conflict: the combination of technological innovation, human courage, and bureaucratic persistence that allowed a democracy to compete with a dictatorship in the most dangerous game ever played. For 6 years, the Halibut and her successors recorded Soviet naval communications without detection. For 6 years, American intelligence analysts had access to information that the Soviet leadership believed was completely secure. For 6 years, the United States held an advantage that helped shape the Cold War's eventual outcome. It ended with betrayal, as so many secret operations do, but by then, the damage to Soviet confidence was done, the advantage had been exploited, the lessons had been learned. And somewhere in the deep waters of the Pacific, other submarines continued the silent work that the Halibut had begun, watching, listening, recording. The sea keeps its secrets well, but sometimes, with enough courage and ingenuity, those secrets can be discovered. The Soviets learned that lesson the hard way. The legacy of Operation Ivy Bells extended far beyond the intelligence it gathered. It created a template for underwater surveillance that would be refined and expanded over the following decades. The technology developed for the Halibut became the foundation for increasingly sophisticated systems that remain classified to this day. In the years following the Halibut's missions, the Navy continued to invest in special operations submarines. The USS Parche, which took over the Ivy Bells mission, would go on to become the most decorated ship in naval history, earning an unprecedented number of unit citations for missions that remain classified. Her crew received awards for operations that they could never discuss, their achievements known only to the small community of intelligence professionals who understood their value. The techniques pioneered by the Halibut also influenced submarine design. Modern attack submarines incorporate features that trace their lineage directly to the modifications made to the Halibut in the late 1960s. The ability to deploy divers, operate remotely controlled vehicles, and sit motionless on the ocean floor for extended periods became standard requirements for a new class of special operations submarines. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Ivy Bells was psychological. The discovery that American submarines could penetrate supposedly secure Soviet waters and tap their most protected communications fundamentally changed Soviet thinking about underwater security. They could never again assume that any location was truly safe from American surveillance. This uncertainty had strategic consequences. The Soviets had to invest resources in protecting their underwater communications, resources that might otherwise have gone to offensive capabilities. They had to assume that any underwater installation might be compromised, leading to increased encryption and security procedures that slowed their operations and complicated their command structure. The paranoia was justified. After Ivy Bells was compromised, the United States didn't stop conducting underwater surveillance. New targets were identified. New technologies were developed. The game continued, just in different locations with different equipment. The men who participated in these operations carried their experiences for the rest of their lives. Some found the secrecy liberating, allowing them to compartmentalize their service and move on to civilian careers. Others found it burdensome, unable to share the most significant experiences of their lives with family or friends. One former Halibut crew member, speaking decades after his service ended, described the strange duality of their experience. "We did things that would have been front-page news if anyone had known about them," he said. "We risked our lives in ways that most people couldn't imagine. And then we came home and couldn't tell anyone. Not our wives, not our parents, not anyone." You learn to live with that, but it never completely goes away. The saturation divers faced particular challenges. The physical demands of deep-sea diving, even with the best equipment available, took a toll on their bodies. Many experienced joint problems, neurological issues, and other health effects related to their work at extreme depths. Some of these effects didn't appear until years after their service ended. There was also the psychological burden of working in conditions of absolute isolation and vulnerability. Divers who had operated in the freezing waters of the Sea of Okhotsk described dreams that haunted them for years afterward. The darkness, the cold, the knowledge that rescue was impossible if anything went wrong. These experiences left marks that time couldn't completely erase. Yet none of them expressed regret for their service. The sense of participating in something historically significant, even if that significance could never be publicly acknowledged, provided a form of compensation that official recognition could never match. They knew what they had done, even if no one else ever would. The story of Ivy Bells finally became public knowledge in the mid-1980s, when Ronald Pelton's espionage trial revealed some of the operation's details. Even then, much remained classified. The full scope of what the Halibut had accomplished, the technical details of the wiretapping devices, the complete record of intelligence gathered, all of this remained hidden behind walls of classification that have only partially been lowered in the decades since. Historians who have studied the Cold War recognize Ivy Bells as one of the most significant intelligence operations of the era. It demonstrated capabilities that the Soviets had believed impossible. It provided insights that influenced American strategic planning for years. And it showed that in the endless competition between intelligence and counterintelligence, creativity and courage could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The USS Halibut herself is gone now, reduced to scrap metal decades ago. No museum preserves her hull or displays her remarkable equipment. The only memorials to her service are the memories of her crew and the classified records of her missions, stored in vaults that most people will never access. But her story survives, passed down through the submarine community and gradually revealed to the public as classification restrictions have eased. It's a story that deserves to be remembered, not just for its historical significance, but for what it reveals about human capability under extraordinary circumstances. The Halibut's crew operated in an environment where failure meant death or imprisonment, where success meant silence, and where the stakes included the fate of nations. They accepted these conditions voluntarily, driven by a sense of duty and adventure that their peacetime contemporaries could barely comprehend. They were ordinary men, sailors, divers, technicians, officers, who performed extraordinary deeds in the service of their country. Most of them returned to ordinary lives when their service ended, their heroism unrecognized and their stories untold. Until now. The Soviets thought their submarines were untrackable. They thought the Sea of Okhotsk was impenetrable. They thought their underwater communications were completely secure. The USS Halibut proved them wrong on every count. For 6 years, she and her crew operated in waters that should have been impossible to enter, gathering intelligence that should have been impossible to obtain, achieving success that should have been impossible to imagine. It was, in many ways, the perfect Cold War mission, audacious in conception, brilliant in execution, devastating in impact. And like so many perfect secrets, it was eventually betrayed, not by any flaw in the operation itself, but by the all-too-human weakness of a man who valued money more than his country's security. The betrayal ended the operation, but couldn't erase its accomplishments. The intelligence had been gathered, the advantage had been exploited, the lesson had been taught. In the silent depths of the ocean, the Halibut had written a chapter of history that remained classified for decades. Now, finally, that story can be told. And what a story it is! The development of the Ivy Bell's wiretapping device represented one of the most significant technological achievements of the Cold War. The challenge facing the engineers was formidable. They needed to create a device that could intercept communications from an underwater cable without physically cutting the cable or providing any detectable evidence of its presence. The solution drew on principles of electromagnetic induction that had been understood since the 19th century, but applied them in ways that had never been attempted before. The device wrapped around the cable like a collar, with induction coils positioned to pick up the weak electromagnetic fields generated by the electrical signals passing through the cable's conductors. These signals were incredibly faint. The device had to be sensitive enough to detect them while also being robust enough to withstand the crushing pressure and corrosive environment of the deep ocean. It had to operate for weeks at a time without any external power source, and it had to record the intercepted signals on magnetic tape that could later be retrieved and analyzed. The engineering team that created this device included some of the most talented minds in American industry. They worked under conditions of extreme secrecy, often not knowing the full purpose of the components they were designing. Only a handful of people understood how all the pieces fit together. The final device was a masterpiece of Cold War engineering. It could be installed by divers working in darkness, attached to a cable using clamps that could be operated with thick gloves. Its recording system could capture weeks of communications on tape cartridges that could be swapped without disturbing the device's attachment to the cable. Most remarkably, the device was completely passive. It emitted no signals that could be detected by Soviet equipment. It drew no power from the cable itself. As far as the Soviets could tell, the cable was functioning normally. The only way to discover the tap was to physically examine the cable, something they had no reason to do as long as their communications continued to function. This passivity was crucial to the operation's success. Active surveillance equipment can be detected by the signals it emits. The Ivy Bell's device emitted nothing. It simply sat on the ocean floor, silently recording everything that passed through the cable, waiting for an American submarine to retrieve its recordings. The retrieval process itself required careful planning. The submarines couldn't simply surface near the device and send divers down to collect the tapes. That would risk detection by Soviet surface ships or aircraft. Instead, the entire retrieval operation had to be conducted from depth, with the submarine hovering near the ocean floor while divers swam to the device, swapped the tape cartridges, and returned to the submarine. Each retrieval mission was nearly as dangerous as the original installation. The submarines had to return to the same location in Soviet waters, navigating through the same patrol areas and listening for the same Soviet sonar. The divers had to work in the same freezing, pitch-black conditions. And the consequences of detection remained the same. No rescue, no negotiation, no survival. The crews accepted these risks because they understood the value of what they were obtaining. Each tape cartridge contained weeks of Soviet naval communications, orders, reports, technical discussions, personal messages. When analyzed by intelligence professionals in Washington, these recordings provided a window into Soviet military thinking that no other source could match. Some of the intelligence was immediately actionable. Warning of Soviet submarine movements allowed American forces to position themselves advantageously. Technical details about Soviet equipment informed American weapons development. Organizational information revealed vulnerabilities in Soviet command structures. Other intelligence was more subtle but equally valuable. By listening to how Soviet officers communicated with each other, American analysts could assess morale, understand decision-making processes, and predict how the Soviet Navy might respond to various scenarios. This kind of intelligence couldn't be obtained from spy satellites or human sources. It required the kind of intimate access that only the Ivy Bells program could provide. The program's success created pressure to expand its scope. Intelligence officials, hungry for more information, pushed for additional cable taps in other locations. Technical teams worked to improve the recording devices, extending their operational life and increasing their storage capacity. The Navy explored new locations where Soviet cables might be vulnerable to similar operations. This expansion increased both the program's intelligence value and its vulnerability to exposure. More operations meant more people with knowledge of what was happening. More equipment meant more opportunities for security breaches. The circle of secrecy that protected Ivy Bells was expanding, and with each expansion came increased risk. Ronald Pelton was one of the people who learned about the program through this expansion. As an NSA analyst, he had legitimate access to intelligence reports derived from Ivy Bell's intercepts. He understood the program's value and knew enough details to make his information attractive to the Soviets. When Pelton walked into the Soviet embassy in 1980, he carried in his head the key to unraveling one of America's most successful intelligence operations. His betrayal was motivated by financial desperation. He was deeply in debt and saw selling secrets as a way out of his problems. The $35,000 the Soviets paid him seemed like an enormous sum at the time. It was trivial compared to the damage he caused. The intelligence value of Ivy Bells, measured over its years of operation, was essentially incalculable. The program had provided insights that influenced American military strategy, diplomatic negotiations, and technical development. All of this was compromised by a single act of treachery. The Soviets acted quickly once they understood what Pelton had told them. Within months, they had located and recovered the Ivy Bells device. Soviet naval intelligence analyzed its components, gaining insight into American surveillance technology that helped them improve their counterintelligence capabilities. More importantly, the discovery forced the Soviets to assume that all their underwater communications had been compromised for years. They couldn't know exactly what the Americans had learned or how that information had been used. This uncertainty was itself damaging, forcing Soviet planners to revise assumptions and reconsider decisions that had been made based on the belief that their communications were secure. The aftermath of the Pelton betrayal illustrated a fundamental truth about intelligence operations. Success and failure are often intertwined. Ivy Bells had succeeded beyond all expectations, providing intelligence that gave America a significant advantage in the Cold War. But that very success made the program a valuable target, and when it was betrayed, the consequences were proportionally severe. The men who had risked their lives to install and service the Ivy Bells device watched from the sidelines as their work was exposed and destroyed. Some felt anger at Pelton, whose greed had erased years of their effort. Others felt a strange kind of relief that the mission was finally acknowledged, even if only in the context of espionage and betrayal. Captain James Bradley, who had conceived and championed the Halibut's transformation, saw his life's work partially vindicated by the public exposure of Ivy Bells. The program's success, now a matter of court record, confirmed what he had known all along, that creative thinking and willingness to take risks could accomplish things that conventional wisdom deemed impossible. But Bradley also understood that the full story of Ivy Bells would never be told in his lifetime. The details that remained classified, the full scope of intelligence gathered, the other operations that continued after the compromise, the technical capabilities that had been developed, would stay hidden for decades, perhaps forever. He would go to his grave knowing that his greatest achievements would be footnotes in a history that most people would never read. The USS Halibut was more than a submarine. She was a symbol of what American ingenuity and courage could accomplish in the shadow wars of the Cold War. Her crew operated in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance, facing dangers that most people couldn't imagine and accepting sacrifices that most people wouldn't make. They did it without recognition, without public gratitude, without the satisfaction of seeing their achievements celebrated. They did it because they believed in something larger than themselves, because they understood that the Cold War was fought not just with missiles and tanks, but with information and stealth and patience. The Soviets thought their subs were untrackable. They thought their communications were secure. They thought the Sea of Okhotsk was their private sanctuary, impenetrable to any adversary. For 6 years, the USS Halibut proved them wrong. For 6 years, she and her crew operated in waters that should have been impossible to enter, recording secrets that should have been impossible to obtain. For 6 years, they gave America an advantage that helped shape the course of the Cold War. Then a trader sold their secrets for $35,000, and it all came crashing down. But by then, the damage was done. The advantage had been exploited, the intelligence had been gathered, and somewhere in the archives of American intelligence, the recordings from those years of silent surveillance preserve a moment in history when a submarine named Halibut and her extraordinary crew accomplished the impossible. Their story deserves to be remembered, not because it ended in triumph, in some ways it ended in tragedy, but because it shows what ordinary people can achieve when they're willing to take extraordinary risks. The Halibut's crew didn't have superpowers or special advantages. They had training, dedication, and a willingness to enter the most dangerous waters on Earth in service of their country. That's a story worth telling. That's a legacy worth preserving. And that's why, decades after the Halibut was scrapped and her crew scattered to the winds, we still remember what happened in the cold, dark waters of the Sea of Okhotsk. The Soviets thought they were safe. The Halibut proved they weren't. And now you know the rest of the story.